So you're hiking through some of the most beautiful, serene landscapes on Earth, feeling the cool breeze, and then suddenly, nature strikes without warning. In Yellowstone, a seemingly peaceful trek turns deadly when a grizzly bear attacks a hiker at close range. In the heart of the Himalayas, a once-in-a-century snowstorm traps trekkers on the Annapurna circuit, claiming dozens of lives. On Mount Ontake, a quiet mountain eruption changes everything in an instant, burying hikers under ash and rock. And deep in Zion's Keyhole Canyon, flash floods sweep away a group of canyoneers despite warnings. These are just some of the most horrifying outdoor deaths ever recorded. In each case, the beauty of the landscape masked the deadly force of nature that awaited, proving that in the wild, danger is often closer than you think. Would you enter a narrow slot canyon if rangers warned you there was a 40% chance of rain? On September 14, 2015, 7 experienced hikers from California looked up at clear blue skies and decided to go for it. But about 90 minutes later, all 7 of them were dead, swept away by a flash flood that turned Keyhole Canyon into a death trap. Rangers knew the flood was coming. They issued warnings, they closed the canyons, but there was no way to tell the people who were already inside. This is the worst canyoneering disaster in American history, and the gap that killed these 7 people still exists today. The Valencia hiking crew had been planning this trip for months. Mark McKenzie, 56, had secured the permits. Steve Arthur, 58, was a Ventura County Sheriff's Sergeant with a Medal of Valor who hiked with his wife Linda, 57, a grandmother of 7. Don Teichner, 55, Gary Favela, 51, Muku Reynolds, 59, and Robin Brum, 53, rounded out the group. They weren't reckless, they were experienced weekend hikers who'd taken an introductory canyoneering course that morning and understood the risks. At 7:40 that morning, Mark picked up their permit. The forecast showed a 40% chance of rain and moderate flood risk, and rangers warned them to monitor conditions and be prepared to turn back. And by noon, the weather still looked fine, so sometime between 3 and 4:30 in the afternoon, they took a group photo at the canyon entrance and descended into Keyhole. But here's what they didn't know: once you drop into that first rappel, you're committed. The Keyhole is only 3/4 of a mile long, but the walls rise 40 feet straight up, sometimes only a few feet apart, and there's no way out until you reach the other end. The canyon funnels water from miles away, and when rain hits the hardened desert soil upstream, it all runs straight into that narrow slot, turning a trickle into a wall of water in minutes. At 2:22 in the afternoon, the National Weather Service issued a flash flood warning for Zion. Rangers immediately closed all canyons and suspended permits, but the Valencia group was already inside with no cell service and no way to receive the warning. Zion covers 90% wilderness, and there's no radio system, no sirens, nothing that can reach people once they're in the backcountry. Rangers can only hope visitors see the warning before they enter. But there was another group in Keyhole that day. Jim Cleary, a 42-year-old professional guide from Escalante, had brought his brother and 2 brothers-in-law into the canyon around 4:15 despite the weather warnings. When they reached the first rappel, the Valencia hiking crew was just starting down, laughing and cheering as they set up their ropes. Cleary's group passed them and continued on, but by 4:30, the sky had darkened and rain was falling hard, so Cleary made the call to get out immediately. They rushed through the canyon and reached the road just as water began rising behind them, and that's when they realized the 7 hikers they'd passed minutes earlier were still trapped inside. Between 4:30 and 5:30, Zion Canyon received 0.63 inches of rain in less than an hour. The Virgin River went from 55 cubic feet per second to 2,630 cubic feet per second in 15 minutes. Flash floods in slot canyons don't arrive gradually. They arrive as a wall of churning water mixed with rocks, logs, and debris, hitting with a force so powerful there's no chance to escape. The Valencia hiking crew never had a chance. At 5:30, Cleary reported to rangers that 7 people were still in the canyon. Rangers found their vehicles at the trailhead but couldn't initiate rescue operations because the canyon was still flooding and weather was unstable. The next morning, more than 60 search and rescue personnel began working the area. Over 3 days, they recovered all 7 bodies, scattered miles downstream in Clear Creek and Pine Creek drainage. Steve Arthur was found first on Tuesday afternoon. Linda Arthur, who'd been carried the farthest, was found last on Thursday morning. After 760 hours of search effort, the operation concluded. The investigation found that everyone had done what they were supposed to do, and yet 7 people still died. Group had a legal permit, they'd been warned about the weather, they'd taken a canyoneering course that morning. The flash flood warning wasn't issued until after they'd entered the canyon, and there was no way to tell them the situation had changed. The shall issue permit policy meant rangers couldn't have denied them access anyway because there wasn't an official warning in effect when they picked up the permit that morning. Once they were inside Keyhole Canyon, there was no mechanism to warn them to get out. This is the fatal flaw. Permits are issued in the morning before weather develops, but flash flood warnings are issued in the afternoon when storms actually form. That creates a gap where people are making decisions based on outdated information, and in Zion's backcountry, there's no way to close that gap. This wasn't the first time it happened. In 1961, 4 Boy Scouts and their Scoutmaster were killed in a flash flood at Zion. In 1993, 2 Scout leaders died. In 1998, 2 more hikers drowned. In 2001, a 10-year-old boy was washed away. In 2014, another hiker drowned. The pattern was documented for decades, and nothing fundamentally changed. After 2015, Zion made some improvements, better coordination with outfitters, improved weather sharing, but the shall issue permit policy is still in place. There's still no in-canyon communication system, and Keyhole Canyon is still open with the same permit limits. In August 2022, a 29-year-old woman named Jital Agnihotri drowned in a flash flood in the Narrows, proving the gap still exists. The children of Steve and Linda Arthur said their parents were extremely cautious and had been watching weather reports closely, but they didn't get cell service at the trailhead. "This is nothing but a freak accident," the family said, "a true case of being at the wrong place at the wrong time." But the alternative is that 7 people died in the gap between a warning being issued and that warning being delivered, and that gap is still there today. But 600 miles west in California's Yosemite National Park, another iconic formation has been killing people in a strikingly similar way, except instead of flash floods in narrow canyons, it's sudden thunderstorms on exposed granite. Would you climb 400 feet up a 45-degree granite slope using nothing but metal cables for handholds if you knew that 6 out of every 11 people who died there had slipped on wet rock and fallen hundreds of feet to their deaths? Half Dome is an 8,800-foot granite monolith in Yosemite National Park, California, and it's one of the most iconic rock formations in America, rising nearly 5,000 feet above the valley floor with a distinctive shape that looks like a dome cut in half. Every summer, thousands of hikers attempt the grueling 16-mile round-trip trail that ends with a cable-assisted climb up the final 400 feet of smooth granite to reach the summit, and most of them make it safely. But on July 13, 2024, 20-year-old Grace Roloff reached the top smiling ear to ear, told her father she loved him, and 10 minutes later, both of her feet went out from under her on the descent, and she slid off to the side, right by him, down the mountain, falling 250 feet to her death. This is the story of how the same conditions have been killing people on Half Dome for 76 years, and how the solution that was supposed to fix it actually made things worse. Grace Roloff was a second-year student at Arizona State University studying to become a teacher, and she was an experienced hiker who'd conquered some of Arizona's toughest trails with her father Jonathan since she was 13 years old. They'd hiked Humphreys Peak and descended into the Grand Canyon multiple times a year, and Grace had even tackled Angel's Landing at Zion National Park in the snow, So when she secured a permit through the daily lottery system on July 11th, she texted her father immediately saying, "Dad, we got drawn, I'm so excited, we did it, we finally get to go and do this." The next day they drove from Phoenix to Yosemite, and on the morning of July 13th, they started the hike around 8 in the morning after a ranger warned them there were storms in the forecast, but the sky looked fine, so they continued on. By noon, they'd reached the bottom of the cables and the weather was still perfectly clear, so they proceeded up with other hikers, using the metal cables as handrails and stepping on wooden boards placed between support poles that are spaced 10 feet apart. When they reached the summit, the views were outstanding, and Grace told her father she loved him and was grateful to share this moment with him. But moments later, an unsettling thunderclap boomed across the sky and a black cloud came rolling in like gangbusters. Jonathan Roloff told his daughter, "We have got to get down now because we don't want to be up here with any rain." It rolled in literally out of nowhere, and they started descending immediately, but the people in front of them were moving slowly and cautiously, so soon they were all trapped on the cables in a heavy rainstorm. Grace told her father, "Dad, my shoes are so slippery." And he tried to calm her, saying, "Okay, let's do one step at a time." But the problem wasn't their preparation or experience. It was the physics of wet granite. Between each wooden board, there's 10 feet of smooth granite that's been worn down by decades of hikers. And when rain hits that surface, it becomes what Jonathan later described as almost like a sheet of ice. About 3/4 of the way down, both of Grace's feet went out from under her, and her father watched as she slid off to the side, right by him, down the mountain. "It happened so fast," he said later. "I tried to reach my hand up, but she was already gone." He descended as fast as he could because he'd watched her come to a stop and believed she might be alive, but when he reached the bottom and looked over the edge, the mountain was too steep to reach her, so he kept calling out, "Grace, I'm with you. I'm not going to leave you." And he waited 3 hours before rescue climbers reached her body and confirmed she died from a severe head fracture. But this wasn't the first time wet granite had killed someone on Half Dome, and Grace was far from the last victim of this pattern. Since the Sierra Club installed the cables in 1919, 11 people have died from falling on that 400-foot stretch, and 6 of those deaths occurred when the rock was wet. On July 2011, Haley LaFlamme fell 600 feet during a severe thunderstorm. In June 2009, Manoj Kumar slipped when rain and hail made the granite slippery. In September 2019, Danielle Burnett lost her footing when light rain started, and even though multiple hikers below her tried to grab her as she slid past screaming, she was too far away and she fell 500 feet. The pattern was so clear that in 2010 the National Park Service called the situation an emergency and instituted a permit system limiting hikers to 300 per day, down from 1,200 on peak weekends, hoping fewer people on the cables would mean fewer deaths. But a study published in the journal Wilderness and Environmental Medicine found the permits didn't help at all. Researchers compared data from 5 years before to 5 years after and discovered that despite a 66% reduction in daily hikers, there was no significant decrease in incidents, and the incident rate per person had doubled. 7,000 miles west of Yosemite in the Himalayas of Nepal, another popular trekking route has the same fundamental problem, except instead of afternoon thunderstorms on exposed granite, it's cyclones that turn into blizzards, and instead of a dozen deaths spread over a century, it's 43 people killed in a single day. But before we continue, kindly like this video and subscribe for more videos like this, and let us know where you are watching. Would you start climbing a 17,000-foot mountain pass at 4 in the morning if weather forecasters had been tracking a cyclone with 100-mile-per-hour winds for over a week, and if that cyclone had just forced the evacuation of 730,000 people less than 1,000 miles away? The Annapurna Circuit is a 150-mile trekking route that sweeps around 15 Himalayan peaks in Nepal, including the world's 10th highest mountain, and it's one of the most popular treks on Earth, attracting over 20,000 hikers every year and more than 5,000 each October alone. October is peak season because the skies are clear and the weather is perfect. So on the morning of October 14th, 2014, over 200 trekkers were making their way toward Thorong La Pass, the circuit's highest point at 17,769 feet, when a once-in-a-century snowstorm dumped 6 feet of snow in 12 hours and turned the mountain into a whiteout, where the ground became the same color as the sky, and you couldn't tell which way was up and which way was down. By the time the largest rescue operation in Himalayan history ended 5 days later, at least 43 people were dead and 175 were injured with frostbite so severe that many required amputations. And this is the story of how a tracked cyclone that India saw coming days in advance caught Nepal completely off guard, and how survivors walked past the frozen bodies of their friends buried in the snow, and how the government promised reforms that never actually changed anything. The storm that killed 43 people on the Annapurna circuit didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for over a week. On October 6th, meteorologists began tracking a low-pressure area that formed over the Gulf of Thailand, and by October 8th, it had strengthened into Cyclone Hudhud with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. On October 12th, Hudhud made landfall near Visakhapatnam, India, at peak intensity, with sustained winds over 200 kilometers per hour and a central pressure so low that India had evacuated 730,000 residents from coastal towns in the days before it hit. But as the cyclone moved northwest across northern India and weakened into a low-pressure area, it retained substantial tropical moisture from the Bay of Bengal. And when that moisture reached the southern slopes of the Himalayas on October 13th, the cooler temperatures at higher elevations transformed it into snow rather than rain. Then the remnants of Hudhud merged with a deep upper-level trough over the northwestern Indian subcontinent, creating a rare meteorological convergence that scientists later said was the kind of event that climate change would make more likely in the future. Meanwhile, thousands of trekkers were making their way around the Annapurna circuit with no idea what was coming. The circuit takes about 3 weeks to complete and passes through small villages with tea houses where trekkers can rest and eat. And because October is known for clear skies and sunshine, it's the busiest month of the year. On October 12th and 13th, hundreds of trekkers reached Thorong Phidi, the base camp on the east side of Thorong La Pass, and at 6 in the evening on the 13th, snow began to fall, but this wasn't unusual, so they prepared for the standard early morning crossing. The normal procedure is to start climbing around 4 or 5 in the morning using headlamps, and one survivor later described how the headlamps on people's foreheads looked like swarms of fireflies in a procession as they made their way up the mountain in the dark. The weather was around -20 degrees Celsius, and it was still snowing, but the trail was accessible and trekkers continued their ascent, thinking this was just typical October weather. Then at 8 o'clock in the morning on October 14th, heavy snowfall began and visibility dropped to 3 meters, about 10 feet, and within hours the storm had dumped up to 2.5 feet of snow that covered all the trail markers. Paul Sheridan, a 49-year-old police officer from Yorkshire, England, was an experienced hill walker who'd raised concerns about the cyclone with local guides and tea house staff, but they'd all told him not to worry. When the whiteout hit, Sheridan later told BBC Radio that the ground became the same color as the sky, and it was difficult to see which way was up and which way was down, but he managed to spot trail marker poles during brief respites in the storm, and he picked his way down for 2 hours through what he called a maze of poles that sometimes we couldn't see for minutes on end. He thought about 10 people were following him to safety, but it turned out to be more like 150. Sheridan also described conditions where there were biting winds and cold, so severe it froze your eyelids. And he saw people trying to protect their heads with plastic bags and trekkers without gloves in -20-degree weather, and he said it was an accident waiting to happen. Maya Ora, a 21-year-old Israeli woman who admitted she and her companions had no previous experience in such terrain and limited equipment, huddled in a crowded cabin near High Camp with about a dozen others, and after 20 hours inside while the storm raged, they made the decision to try to descend because everybody was saying If you stay, you are going to die of hypothermia or altitude sickness. What Maya saw when she left that cabin haunted her for the rest of her life. "We couldn't see the way," she told The Guardian on October 16th. "There's no path. There's 150 centimeters, 5 feet of snow." Then we were walking between the bodies and bags, and we could see our dead friends and the bodies of the guides. I don't know how many, 20s of them. They are buried under the snow. It will be very difficult to find them. It was horrible, a horror. Other survivors who made it to safety described stripping off their own clothes to help warm people who were on the verge of freezing to death, and when a group of Israeli trekkers finally reached a Chabad center in the city of Pokhara days later, they kept their composure until they spotted their friends, and then they collapsed in tears on the floor. The first call for international help came from the Israeli embassy in Kathmandu after a trapped trekker sent a handwritten note down the mountain with a local Sherpa. And by October 15th, the Nepali army had launched the largest rescue operation ever conducted in the region, flying over 70 helicopter sorties through ongoing blizzard conditions and avalanche risks. By the time rescue operations officially ended on October 19th, 518 people had been rescued, including 304 foreign trekkers. But at least 43 people were dead and 175 were injured, many with severe frostbite that required amputations. The deaths included 21 foreign trekkers from countries around the world, 2 Slovak climbers at Dhaulagiri base camp, and multiple Nepali mountain guides, cooks, porters, and yak herders who'd been working to help the tourists. What made this disaster particularly devastating was that it was entirely preventable. Cyclone Hudhud had been tracked by meteorologists since October 6th, and India had known it was coming and evacuated 750,000 people. But Nepal's tourism ministry later admitted, "We were thinking the cyclone might have a minor effect in Nepal," and didn't establish any warning system to alert trekkers who were already on the trail. And more than a decade later, the Annapurna circuit is still open, and October is still peak season, with thousands of trekkers arriving every year. And while some safety measures have been implemented, the fundamental problem remains unsolved. But now, let's shift to a different kind of danger, one that lies quietly in the wilds of Yellowstone. Here, the risk isn't from a storm, but from a predator that calls these rugged lands home. Would you venture into Yellowstone's backcountry knowing that just one wrong turn could bring you face to face with a grizzly bear? Yellowstone National Park, famous for its geysers and sprawling wilderness, had always prided itself on preserving the untamed heart of America. But on the morning of July 6, 2011, one hiker learned the hard way that in a place this wild, danger often came in silence when everything seemed calm. The Wapiti Lake Trail was a remote path, miles from the nearest road, and on that day, it should have been just another peaceful stretch of backcountry. But 57-year-old Brian Matayoshi and his wife, Cynthia "Cindy" Wallace, had no idea they were about to walk straight into danger. They were experienced hikers, the type to venture far from the crowds, and on this particular day, they set off to explore a part of the park few dared to visit. They were prepared, well prepared, but the park's vastness hid a threat that no one could have seen coming. By early evening, Brian and Cindy were at the base of the trail, about to head back to their campsite. Then, without warning, a mother grizzly bear, startled by their presence, saw them as a threat and charged without hesitation. The bear was protecting her cubs, and in this battle for survival, there was no room for the hikers to retreat. The attack was swift, brutal, and for Brian, it was too much. Within moments, he was fatally mauled, his injuries severe and overwhelming. Cindy was left to stand frozen, heart pounding, her husband lying before her, helpless. The park's rangers were alerted, and by the time help arrived, Brian had already succumbed to the injuries caused by the bear. The bear itself was found later, tranquilized, and put down by the authorities. For the rangers, this was a moment that seemed to crystallize the tension between human curiosity and wild nature. No one had expected it, and no one had seen it coming. Years went by, and Yellowstone continued to welcome millions of visitors, issuing the same guidelines time and time again: make noise, travel in groups, carry bear spray, stay alert. These rules were meant to keep people safe, but they didn't always work. A bear's territory was vast, and no matter how many times rangers warned visitors, there were always gaps, spaces between the advice and the reality of the wilderness. The 2011 attack was the first of its kind in recent years, but as many hikers would soon discover, it wasn't the last. Just 2 years later, in 2013, another bear attack would unfold in the park, this time in the Lamar Valley. A 59-year-old man was attacked while hiking alone, and though he survived, the encounter left him with severe injuries. Yet again, the bear had acted defensively, surprised perhaps by the presence of a hiker too close for comfort. But in these remote, wild areas, there was no room for error. Every second counted. Every move had consequences. In 2021, another attack would remind the world of Yellowstone's dangerous beauty. A hiker, alone, wandered too close to a bear's feeding grounds and was attacked in the early hours of the morning. By the time the park's rangers reached him, the hiker was severely injured but alive. For the survivors, their stories were often filled with regret, their encounters a reminder of the wildness that lay just beyond the trails. But while the grizzly bears of Yellowstone remind us of the untamed forces around us, it's the sudden violence of Mount Ontake's eruption that took a group of unsuspecting trekkers by complete surprise. But before we continue, kindly like this video and subscribe for more videos like this, and let us know where you are watching. How would you react if a peaceful hiking trail suddenly transformed into a deadly inferno of ash and gas? In a moment that would forever change the lives of hikers and the course of history, on September 27, 2014, Mount Ontake, Japan's second highest active volcano, erupted suddenly and violently, claiming the lives of 58 people and leaving dozens more severely injured. This is the story of how a tranquil day of hiking turned into one of Japan's deadliest natural disasters in decades, how the mountain went from a peaceful retreat to a deadly inferno of ash, rock, and gas, and how it shocked the world. The eruption came without warning. It was just before noon when hikers, who had been ascending the mountain's well-worn paths to enjoy the crisp air and sweeping views of the surrounding valleys, were caught off guard. For some, the morning had been ideal for hiking. The weather was clear, and the mountain, popular for pilgrimages and recreational trekking, was crowded with day trippers. As they neared the summit, the serene surroundings suddenly turned to chaos. A steam-driven eruption exploded with a deafening roar, sending plumes of ash and rocks high into the sky. The ground trembled beneath them, and within moments the sky turned black. The eruption wasn't the kind of spectacle that most had expected. There was no warning tremor, no rumblings, just a sudden, violent release of energy. At the time, Mount Ontake had been considered a relatively safe trek for hikers, with minimal volcanic activity in recent years. One survivor, a 52-year-old woman, recalled how she had been on the mountain that fateful day. She described the scene in detail, recounting how the eruption came without warning and how it immediately consumed everything around her in darkness and smoke. "It felt like the world was closing in on me," she said, her voice shaking with the memory. "I could hardly breathe. It was like I was suffocating from the ash." Many trekkers were caught mid-ascent or near the summit with no time to retreat to safety. Some survivors reported seeing others collapse from suffocation, their bodies covered in ash as the hot, toxic gases suffocated them. It was only later that authorities were able to access the area and begin the grim task of recovering bodies. In total, 58 victims were found, many of whom were hikers who had never anticipated a volcanic eruption that would claim their lives so swiftly. One of the key challenges in the aftermath of this disaster was the lack of warning systems in place to alert hikers. Although seismic activity had been detected in the days leading up to the eruption, there was no clear indication that an eruption was imminent. The mountain's sudden and violent eruption caught everyone off guard, and rescue operations were hindered by poor visibility due to the volcanic ash clouds. Helicopter crews couldn't fly safely, and on the ground, visibility was reduced to almost nothing. A 72-year-old woman, who was among the few survivors, recounted how she and others had huddled together, their bodies shaking from the cold as they tried to make their way down the mountain. "We were praying," she said. "We just wanted to get out alive." Authorities later admitted that they had underestimated the volcanic hazard, and Japan's National Police Agency and self-defense forces worked together to recover the bodies of those lost. But the eruption had done its damage, and the sense of safety that many trekkers had felt on Mount Ontake was shattered forever. So, let us know what you think about these cases in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next video.